It was a cold winter evening in Cincinnati. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few brave souls hurrying past, wrapped tightly in coats and scarves to protect themselves from the biting wind. The city seemed quieter than usual, as though the snow, gently falling from the sky, had muffled everything. Streetlights flickered weakly, casting a dim, bluish glow on the wet sidewalks below. The air was heavy with the scent of damp asphalt and the distant hum of car engines. Sergeant Danny Ward had only been back from his deployment for a few days. He was trying to settle into civilian life, but it wasn't easy. The city seemed so different from the places he had been, so distant and cold. His thoughts were scattered as he walked along the icy streets, his hands jammed deep into his coat pockets, his breath escaping in small puffs of mist. Something didn't feel right. An unease had settled deep in his chest, a constant weight pressing against his ribs, something he couldn't shake off. He stopped for a moment, letting the cold wind cut through him. But as he took a deep breath, his gaze caught something in the distance. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. A figure lay on the cold sidewalk near a concrete bench. A dog. Danny's heart skipped a beat as he moved closer. At first he thought it was just another stray, another forgotten creature left to fight for survival in a world that didn't care. But as he got closer, he saw the dog's condition. Its fur was matted with dirt. Its ribs protruded from its body, and its eyes were half open, glazed over. The poor creature was barely moving, its body trembling from the cold or perhaps from exhaustion. It seemed so still, so lifeless. Danny crouched down beside the dog, his pulse quickening as he saw the scar above its right eye. His stomach tightened, painfully, a mix of shock and recognition flooding over him. No, it couldn't be. But there it was, that unmistakable scar. The scar he had seen so many times before. It was Max. Max had been his partner, his battle buddy, and his closest friend during their time in the military. Together, they had fought side by side in war zones, facing danger together, depending on each other for survival. Max had saved his life more times than he could count, charging into dangerous situations without hesitation, always looking out for him. And now, here he was, abandoned on the cold streets, suffering, starving, and forgotten. Danny felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. He reached out, his fingers brushing gently against Max's matted fur. The dog flinched slightly at the touch but didn't react otherwise. Danny's heart sank. This was the dog who had always been strong, fierce, and full of life. But now Max was nothing but a shell of the warrior he once was. Max. "Buddy, it's me," Danny whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The words felt strange on his tongue, and he couldn't believe what he was saying. Max didn't respond at first. He remained still, his breathing shallow and labored. Danny's throat tightened, and he struggled to find the words, his voice choking in his chest. For a moment it felt like everything had stopped. There was no noise, no movement, just the soft rustling of Max's fur as the dog took in slow, shallow breaths. Danny watched helplessly, his mind spinning with confusion and disbelief. How had this happened? How had his loyal companion, his brother in arms, ended up like this? But then, just when Danny was about to give up, he saw it. Max's tail twitched, ever so slightly, just a flicker of movement. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Danny's heart gave a jolt of hope. Max was still alive. He wasn't completely gone yet. The sound of footsteps broke the moment, and Danny turned his head sharply, his hand still resting gently on Max's side. A voice, gruff and weathered, came from behind him. "You know this dog?" Danny turned around quickly, his eyes narrowing as he saw an elderly man standing there watching them. The man had white hair that was unkempt, and his long black coat was buttoned tightly against the cold. He held a leash in his frail hands, and his face was filled with regret and sadness. "Yeah," Danny said, his voice quiet, barely more than a whisper. "He's mine. He's Max, my partner, my brother in war." The old man let out a long sigh, his eyes dark with something Danny couldn't quite place. He took a step closer, then paused, His voice was rough, like it had been used too much. "You need to know what happened to him," the old man said, his words heavy with an unspoken pain. Danny's chest tightened. What could have happened to Max? What had this old man seen? As the two of them stood there facing each other, the cold wind swirling around them, a deep sense of dread settled in Danny's stomach. He needed to know. He had to know what had happened to Max, the dog who had been more than a pet, more than a soldier's companion. Max had been family, and Danny would stop at nothing to find out how his best friend had ended up in this state. But the answers, as it would turn out, would change everything. Danny's mind was still reeling from the discovery of Max lying abandoned in the cold streets. His heart pounded with a mixture of emotions, anger, confusion, and a deep, gnawing pain. The years of service he had shared with Max had forged a bond stronger than words could describe. They had fought together, saved each other's lives countless times, and now, the dog he considered family was lying in front of him, broken and forgotten. It wasn't right. It couldn't be. As he knelt beside Max, gently stroking the dog's matted fur, his thoughts were interrupted by the old man's voice. The words were slow, heavy with regret, and they hung in the air like a dark cloud. "You need to know what happened to him," the man repeated. His voice cracked as he spoke, betraying the deep sorrow in his eyes. He didn't deserve this. None of them do. Danny looked up at the old man, his jaw clenched in frustration. "What do you mean? How did he end up like this? He was a hero. He was the best damn K-9 I ever had." The man shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the ground as though he were searching for the right words. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "The military sold him," the old man said, his words sending a shockwave through Danny. "They sold Max, after his last mission. Said he was unfit for service, just like that, no ceremony, no honor, just paperwork. And then, they sold him." Danny's stomach twisted into knots. The very idea that the military, the institution he had given so much for, could betray Max like this was almost too much to comprehend. He had seen the horrors of war, felt the weight of the battlefield, but he had never imagined that the system he had trusted would turn its back on the dogs who had served alongside them. "They sold him?" Danny repeated, his voice trembling with disbelief. He stood up, pacing back and forth as his thoughts raced. "What do you mean? Who would do such a thing?" The old man hesitated, his face clouded with guilt. "A private security company," he said softly. "Vanguard Security Group. They bought Max and other retired K-9s from the military. They promised to take care of them, promised a good life. But that wasn't the reality. They overworked them, pushed them past their limits, and when they couldn't perform anymore, they discarded them. Just like that." Danny's hands balled into fists at his sides, his chest tightening with rage. "Vanguard Security?" he muttered, the name burning in his mind. "Those bastards. How could they do that?" The old man nodded, his weathered eyes filled with sorrow. "They didn't treat them like soldiers. They treated them like tools. Used them until they couldn't be used anymore, and then they threw them away. Max wasn't the only one. There are others. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They all ended up like this, discarded, forgotten." The words hit Danny like a punch to the gut. He could hardly breathe. The dog who had once been his protector, his partner in arms, had been sold off like a piece of equipment. He had trusted the military to take care of him, to honor his service, but now he realized the truth. Max had been nothing more than a commodity, and it wasn't just Max, there were others too. "Where is he now?" Danny asked, his voice cold and hard, his mind racing. "Where's Max been since then?" The old man looked away, a deep sigh escaping his lips. "I found him a few days ago," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "He was starving, lying in an alley behind an old warehouse. I tried to help him. I fed him what little I had, but he's been through too much. The damage is done." Danny's heart broke at the thought of Max being left to suffer alone. He had no idea how long the dog had been wandering the streets, how much pain he had endured in silence. And now, after all the years of loyalty, the betrayal was complete. "Who's responsible for this?" Danny demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Who's the person behind this cruelty?" The old man hesitated, his hands trembling, as he clutched the leash tighter. "I don't know exactly," he said, his voice cracking. "But the company, Vanguard, they were the ones who sold him. After that, it's a blur. I don't know who's been keeping him, but they didn't treat him right. Overworked, underfed, and when he couldn't do what they wanted, they threw him away like trash." Danny clenched his jaw, his mind spinning with anger. "They threw him away," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Max deserved better than this. He deserved respect. He deserved more than being discarded like he was nothing. A flicker of recognition crossed the old man's face, and he took a deep breath as if making a decision. "There's something you should know," he said, his voice grave. "Vanguard security isn't the only problem. There are others involved. Powerful people. People who don't care about these dogs. They use them up and throw them away when they're no longer useful." Danny's heart sank as the weight of the situation hit him. He had always believed that the system would protect those who served, that the military would honor the sacrifices made by its soldiers and their K-9 companions. But now he realized that wasn't the case. The dogs who had given everything for their handlers had been betrayed by the very system that was supposed to care for them. "I'm going to make sure they pay for this," Danny said, his voice filled with determination. "Max deserves justice, and I'm going to get it for him." The old man looked at him, his eyes filled with something close to hope. "Be careful, son," he said quietly. "These people don't play by the rules. They'll do whatever it takes to protect their secrets." Danny nodded, his mind already made up. He would find out who was responsible for Max's suffering, and once he did, he would make sure they paid for what they had done. As he turned away from the old man, he looked down at Max one last time. The dog's breathing was shallow, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Max wasn't gone yet. He still had fight in him. And so did Danny. Together, they would face whatever came next. The battle for justice had just begun. Danny sat motionless in his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension. His mind raced with the thoughts of Max lying broken and weak and the betrayal he had suffered. It was a betrayal not just from the military, but from a system that had promised to protect him. Max, the loyal companion who had fought beside him in the worst of times, had been discarded as though he was nothing more than a broken tool. But that wasn't the end of the story. Not for Max. Not for Danny. Danny's pulse still hammered in, his ears as he stared out of the windshield, the cold air from the cracked window rushing in, mixing with the heat of his anger. He had made a promise to himself. He would find out everything about Vanguard Security Group, the company that had sold Max like a commodity, treated him like trash, and abandoned him when he could no longer perform. It wasn't just about getting answers anymore. It was about justice. Max deserved that, and so did every other dog who had been betrayed by the same system. As the evening darkened, Danny's eyes scanned the streets, his thoughts consumed by what he had learned so far. He couldn't just sit back and let this slide. He had spent his whole career protecting his brothers and sisters in arms. Now it was time to do the same for Max. The anger bubbling inside him felt like a fire, and it was driving him forward, pushing him to act. He took out his phone, the cold glass screen glowing faintly in the dark, and pulled up the contact information for his old military buddies. There were a few names that stood out, men he had trusted with his life on the battlefield. They were loyal, just like him, and they owed Max just as much. He needed them. Danny pressed the call button on the first, a name. His heart pounded as he waited for the connection. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Danny, it's been a while." "Luke," Danny said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end before Luke spoke again, his voice lower, cautious. "What's going on, Danny?" I've got a situation. It's about Vanguard security. They're running a dogfighting operation, and they've been buying up retired military K-9s, Max included. But they're not just buying them. They're abusing them, pushing them to the brink, and then tossing them away like they're nothing. Max, he's in bad shape. They left him to die in the streets. I need to know everything about Vanguard. I need names, addresses, whatever you can dig up. Luke was silent for a long moment. Danny could feel the weight of the pause on the other end, knowing that the man on the line understood the gravity of the situation. Finally, Luke spoke, his voice thick with disbelief. Vanguard security? You're sure about this? I'm sure, Danny said, his voice firm. I've seen it with my own eyes. They sold Max, used him, and then threw him away. I need you to find out everything. We're going after them. Luke sighed, the sound of the exhale heavy with resignation. All right, Danny, I'll get to work. But you need to be careful. You know what this could turn into. I don't care about the risks, Danny said, his voice low and full of determination. Max was there for me. Now it's my turn to be there for him. I'll start pulling records, but Danny, this goes deep. You might not like what we uncover. I don't care, Danny replied, his resolve unwavering. Just get me the information. The call ended with a quiet click, and Danny sat there for a moment staring at the phone in his hand. He had taken the first step. Now it was time to take the next one. The following days were a blur of action. Danny spent his time reaching out to old contacts, pulling together any scrap of information he could find. He was relentless. He wasn't going to let this go. He couldn't. He also made regular visits to the clinic where Max was being treated. The dog had been stabilized, but Danny knew that the road to recovery was going to be long. Every day, Max seemed to improve a little, but the damage done to him, both physically and emotionally, was far from healed. Danny stayed by his side, comforting him, talking to him, reminding him that he was not alone. Max had given everything for him. Now, Danny would do the same. As Danny gathered more information about Vanguard, it became clear that the company was involved in much more than just the abuse of retired K-9s. They were connected to illegal contracts, human trafficking, and several other dark dealings that had gone unnoticed by the authorities. The deeper Danny dug, the darker the truth became. Vanguard wasn't just a rogue company, they were part of something much bigger, something that reached into the highest levels of power. Danny felt the weight of it all pressing down on him, but he refused to back down. He couldn't. Not when Max's life was on the line. One evening, after a long day of investigation, Danny was sitting at his kitchen table when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Luke. He quickly opened it, his heart pounding in his chest as he read the words. I've got something. They're running an illegal operation out of a compound in Kentucky. I've got the address. It's heavily guarded, but it's where they're hiding the evidence. I'll send you the details. Danny's fingers tightened around the phone, and for a moment he just stared at the screen. This was it. The place where all the answers lay. He had what he needed. But as he read the address, his heart sank. He wasn't going to wait any longer. It was time to face the people who had done this to Max, and to put an end to it. Once and for all. The air was thick with tension as Danny's truck rumbled down the dark, winding roads leading out of Cincinnati. The headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the empty stretch of highway ahead, but Danny couldn't shake the sense of urgency gnawing at him. His knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel so tightly, the metal feeling cold and foreign in his hands. His mind was racing, but it wasn't fear that drove him now. It was something far stronger. The need for justice. The address Luke had sent him was for an old, abandoned warehouse just outside Lexington, Kentucky. But it wasn't just an abandoned warehouse anymore. Danny had learned that it was now a private, off-the-books training facility for Vanguard Security Group. It was a place where the company kept its illegal operations hidden, a place where the dogs they had discarded were forced into brutal, unlawful training. He knew he was going to walk into something dangerous. He could feel it in his bones. Max's face kept flashing in his mind, the way he had looked in the street, weak and broken, eyes vacant. Danny had never been able to forget the look of recognition in the dog's eyes when they first made contact. That flicker of hope had been enough to remind Danny of what they had been through together. Max deserved better, and Danny would be damned if he didn't make sure he got it. As he neared the compound, his thoughts raced with 1,000 different scenarios. What if he wasn't able to stop them? What if Vanguard had more to lose than just a few K-9s? But those thoughts weren't enough to stop him. He couldn't turn back. Not now. Not after everything Max had given for him. He pulled his truck up to the entrance where 2 large security gates loomed, their iron bars standing tall and ominous against the darkened landscape. He parked a few yards away, his headlights cutting through the gloom, casting long shadows across the compound. The place was heavily guarded, but he had a plan. Danny had spent years training in military operations. He knew how to move quietly, how to stay out of sight, and how to use his environment to his advantage. He checked the time. Midnight. Perfect. Most of the guards would be making their rounds now, which meant there was a small window of opportunity. He pulled his hood over his head and slipped out of the truck, moving with the ease of someone who had spent his life in the shadows. The compound was silent except for the distant hum of machinery and the occasional sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. Danny made his way toward the side of the building, staying low, avoiding the floodlights. His heart raced with anticipation as he approached a small back door. He had studied the layout of the facility, and this was the entry point that would give him the best access to the main building without raising any alarms. Danny reached the door and took a deep breath. He had to move quickly. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his senses heightened, his every muscle tense with the anticipation of what lay ahead. He pulled out a small lock-picking kit and went to work. It took only a few moments, but to him, it felt like an eternity. Finally, the lock clicked open. Danny slipped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. He was in. Now came the hard part. The interior of the building was dimly lit, shadows cast across the floor as Danny crept through the narrow hallways, careful not to make a sound. He knew this was where the dogs were being kept. This was where they were, trained, mistreated, and abandoned. He couldn't let them suffer anymore. He had to stop Vanguard once and for all. As he moved deeper into the building, Danny's breath came in shallow, controlled bursts. His mind was focused, sharp. He could hear voices in the distance and the sound of heavy doors opening and closing. He knew he was getting closer to the heart of the operation, but he also knew he had to be careful. If he wasn't, it wouldn't just be his life at risk, it would be Max's too. He rounded a corner and froze. Ahead of him, he saw a man in a security uniform, his back turned. Danny's instincts kicked in. He silently moved into position, slipping past the guard without making a sound. His hand grazed the man's shoulder, but the guard didn't even flinch. Danny had done this countless times before, silently taking down threats, securing the perimeter, always on alert. This time, though, there was something different. This time, it was personal. Danny continued on, moving deeper into the building. The hallways narrowed, and the air grew thicker with the smell of sweat and rust. As he turned another corner, he found himself in front of a heavy door, its windows barred with metal. Inside, he could hear the faint sound of barking. The dogs. Max was in there, he could feel it in his gut. He paused for a moment, collecting himself. He had one shot at this. He could feel the weight of his mission pressing on his shoulders. No matter what happened next, there was no turning back. Danny pushed open the door, and the sight before him made his blood run cold. The room was filled with cages, each containing a dog, some lying motionless, others pacing in their small spaces, their eyes dull and lifeless. Max's cage was near the back, and Danny's heart skipped a beat when he saw the familiar, weak form lying inside. Max's eyes were open, but they were filled with pain and exhaustion. His once proud, muscular body was thin and frail, his coat dull and patchy. But when he saw Danny, his tail flicked ever so slightly. That flicker of recognition, that spark of hope, was enough to make Danny's heart swell with emotion. He rushed to Max's cage, bending down to open it, his hands shaking with a mixture of anger and relief. "We're getting out of here, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't care about the danger, the armed guards, or the consequences. Max was family, and he wasn't leaving without him. Just as he was about to lift Max into his arms, a voice boomed from behind him. "You're not going anywhere, soldier." Danny turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw the tall figure of Victor Holloway, the CEO of Vanguard Security Group, standing in the doorway. Holloway's eyes were cold and calculating, and the smug look on his face made Danny's blood boil. "You think you can just walk in here and take what's mine?" Holloway sneered. Danny stood up slowly, his jaw clenched. "This isn't yours, Holloway," he growled. "This is Max's, and you're going to pay for what you've done to him." The final confrontation had begun.